I was just another night shift taxi driver in the ferrying drunk partygoers and weary travelers alike. I'd seen my fair share of strange passengers, but nothing could have prepared me for what awaited me on that rain-soaked evening. Even now, as I write this, I question whether I should share my experience. But perhaps by putting it to paper, I can finally exorcise the ghosts that have haunted me since that night. The rhythmic patter of rain against my windshield had been my constant companion for hours. It was nearing the end of my shift, the digital clock on my dashboard blinking 11:43 p.m. The streets of Millbrook were emptying, save for the occasional hurried pedestrian ducking under shop awnings for shelter. I was considering calling it a night when my radio crackled to life. Unit 17, pick up at the corner of Elm and 5th. You free? I sighed, my hand hovering over the radio. One more fare couldn't hurt, I thought. Unit 17 here. I'll take it. As I navigated the slick streets, the rain intensified. Sheets of water cascaded down my windshield, the wipers struggling to keep up. The weather seemed to mirror my mood, gloomy and foreboding. Something about this night felt different. Pulling up to the corner, I peered through the rain-streaked windows. At first, I saw nothing. Then, emerging from the mist like a specter, a figure appeared. A woman, dressed in white, her pale face a stark contrast against the darkness. She glided towards the cab, and I felt an inexplicable chill run down my spine. As she opened the back door, a gust of cold air swept through the vehicle. I shivered, adjusting the heater. "Where to, miss?" I asked, trying to mask my unease. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "Oakwood Cemetery, please." I hesitated. Oakwood was on the outskirts of town, a good 30-minute drive in this weather. And who visits a cemetery at this hour? But a fare was a fare. I nodded, pulled away from the curb, and began what would become the most terrifying ride of my life. As we drove through the rain-slicked streets, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. I glanced in the rear-view mirror, trying to get a better look at my passenger. What I saw, or rather didn't see, made my blood run cold. The woman was there, her pale face and white dress visible in the dim light. But where her reflection should have been in the mirror, there was nothing. Just the empty back seat, as if I were driving alone. I blinked hard, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me. When I looked again, the situation remained the same. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles turning white. Clearing my throat, I attempted to strike up a conversation, hoping to dispel the growing tension. "Nasty weather we're having, huh?" My voice sounded strained even to my own ears. Silence. The woman didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. Her eyes, dark and unfathomable, stared straight ahead. I tried again. "Any particular reason for visiting the cemetery so late?" Still no response. The only sound was the rhythmic swish of the wipers and the drum of rain on the roof. As we continued our journey, I noticed the temperature in the cab dropping steadily. My breath began to fog in front of me, despite the heater running full blast. The chill seemed to emanate from the back seat, spreading through the vehicle like a living thing. The streets became less familiar as we neared the outskirts of town. Streetlights grew sparse, and the buildings gave way to open fields and patches of dark forest. In the distance, I could make out the silhouette of Oakwood Cemetery's wrought iron gates. A sense of dread washed over me. Every instinct screamed at me to turn the cab around, to flee from whatever awaited us at that cemetery. But something, curiosity, fate, or perhaps some supernatural force, compelled me forward. As we approached the gates, I heard my passenger's voice again, soft but clear. "We're almost home." I didn't know then how true and how terrifying those words would prove to be. As we passed through the cemetery gates, the world seemed to shift. The rain, which had been a constant companion throughout the night, suddenly ceased. An eerie silence descended, broken only by the crunch of gravel under the taxi's tires. I navigated the winding path through the tombstones, my headlights casting long, twisted shadows. The air inside the cab grew impossibly colder, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. My fingers, numb with cold, gripped the steering wheel tightly. "Where exactly in Oakwood did you want to go, miss?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. No response came from the back seat. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, and my heart nearly stopped. The woman was staring directly at me, her dark eyes boring into mine. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something, sadness, hunger, in those bottomless orbs. Suddenly, the cab's radio crackled to life, emitting a high-pitched static that made me wince. Through the noise, I could hear snippets of an old song, the kind they might have played at a dance hall 50 years ago. The music faded in and out, interspersed with what sounded like whispered voices. "Do you hear that?" I asked, but I already knew the answer. The woman in white remained silent, her gaze never leaving mine in the mirror. As we delved deeper into the cemetery, I noticed something odd about our surroundings. The gravestones we passed seemed to change, becoming older, more weathered. The trees grew more gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. I felt as if we were driving not just through space, but through time itself. The world outside the cab windows became a blur of shadows and mist, punctuated by the occasional glint of a tombstone in my headlights. "Please," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Where exactly are we going?" For the first time since entering the cab, the woman spoke. Her voice was soft, with an echo that seemed to come from somewhere far away. "We're going to where it all ended, and where it will begin again." A chill that had nothing to do with the cold ran down my spine. I knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that we were approaching something beyond my understanding, something that would change me forever. The cab rolled to a stop in front of an ancient mausoleum. The structure loomed before us, its stone facade weathered and covered in creeping vines. Above the entrance, barely visible in the gloom, was a name, Blackwood. I turned to inform my passenger that we had arrived, but the words died in my throat. The back seat was empty. No sign of the woman in white, no indication that anyone had been there at all. The only evidence of her presence was the lingering chill in the air. With shaking hands, I turned off the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. I sat there for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts, to make sense of what was happening. Part of me wanted to drive away as fast as I could, to forget this night had ever happened. But a stronger, inexplicable urge compelled me to investigate. I stepped out of the cab, the gravel crunching under my feet. The air was thick with mist, and I could barely see a few feet in front of me. As I approached the mausoleum, I noticed something odd. Despite the total absence of wind, the mist seemed to be swirling around the structure, as if drawn to it. My heart pounding, I reached for the iron handle of the mausoleum door. It was ice cold to the touch, and for a moment I hesitated. This was madness. I should leave, call the police, do anything but enter this foreboding tomb. But then I heard it. A soft weeping, coming from inside the mausoleum. It sounded so lost, so full of sorrow, that before I knew what I was doing, I had pushed open the heavy door. The interior was dark, lit only by a faint, otherworldly glow. As my eyes adjusted, I saw her. The woman in white, standing before a stone sarcophagus. She turned to me, her eyes filled with an ancient sadness. "You've come," she said, her voice echoing in the confined space. "Now you must see. You must understand." And with those words, my world turned upside down. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the wall behind the sarcophagus hung a large, ornate portrait. The subject was a young woman in a white dress, her pale face hauntingly familiar. It was my passenger. With trembling fingers, I approached the portrait, my eyes drawn to the small plaque beneath it. Elizabeth Blackwood, 1923 to 1953, it read. My mind reeled. 1953. That was 70 years ago. "I don't understand," I whispered, turning back to the ghostly woman. She smiled sadly. "On a night much like this, I took my last taxi ride. The driver was drunk. We crashed. He lived. I didn't." As she spoke, the mausoleum seemed to fade away. Suddenly, I was on a rain-slicked road, watching helplessly as a taxi much older than mine swerved and crashed into a tree. I saw the driver stumble out, panic on his face as he realized his passenger wasn't moving. The vision shifted, and I was back in the mausoleum. Elizabeth's ghost stood before me, her form flickering like a candle in the wind. "Every year, on the anniversary of my death, I take one last ride," she explained. "I search for a driver with a kind heart, someone who can help me find peace." I felt a mix of terror and pity. How can I help you?" Her eyes met mine, filled with a desperate hope. "By remembering. By ensuring my story isn't forgotten." As she spoke, I felt a weight settle on my shoulders. I realized I had been chosen for a purpose I never could have imagined when I started my shift that evening. I don't remember leaving the mausoleum or driving out of the cemetery. The next thing I knew, I was on the main road, the familiar lights of the city glowing in the distance. But something had changed. The world seemed different, as if a veil had been lifted from my eyes. As I drove, I became acutely aware of shadows moving at the edge of my vision. Whispers echoed in my ears, snippets of conversations from long ago. In my rearview mirror, I caught glimpses of passengers who had never been there. A man in a 1940s suit, a woman with a beehive hairdo, a child in clothes from another century. My taxi had become a vessel for the echoes of the past, carrying the memories of countless journeys and the ghosts of passengers long gone. The city streets were eerily empty as I made my way home. Every traffic light I approached turned green, as if clearing the way for my haunted vehicle. The rain had stopped, but a thick fog had settled, obscuring the familiar landmarks. As I neared my apartment, a chill ran down my spine. Standing on the corner was Elizabeth, her white dress glowing in the streetlight. Our eyes met as I drove past, and I heard her voice clearly in my mind. "Remember." I parked my taxi and practically ran to my apartment, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. Once inside, I leaned against the door, my heart pounding. The events of the night washed over me, and I struggled to make sense of what had happened. Part of me wanted to dismiss it all as a hallucination, a product of too many late nights and too much stress. But I knew, deep in my bones, that what I had experienced was real. As I finally crawled into bed, the sky beginning to lighten with the approaching dawn, I made a decision. I would remember. I would tell Elizabeth's story. But first, I needed to make some changes in my life. In the days that followed, I found myself unable to shake the memories of that haunting night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Elizabeth's face, heard her plaintive request to be remembered. Sleep became elusive, plagued by nightmares of screeching tires and shattering glass. I tried to return to my normal routine, but everything had changed. The city streets I once knew like the back of my hand now felt foreign and foreboding. Every passenger that entered my cab was scrutinized, my heart racing each time someone climbed into the back seat. Unable to cope, I made the decision to change my shift. No more night drives for me. I switched to day shifts, convincing myself that the bright sunlight would keep the shadows at bay. But even in the harsh light of day, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. I began avoiding certain routes, particularly those that led anywhere near Oakwood Cemetery. The mere thought of driving past those wrought iron gates again filled me with an indescribable dread. My colleagues noticed the change in me. Once known for my easygoing nature and ready smile, I became withdrawn and jumpy. They attributed it to stress, suggesting I take some time off. If only they knew the real reason behind my altered behavior. As weeks turned into months, I realized that my encounter with Elizabeth had fundamentally changed me. I was no longer just a taxi driver. I had become a reluctant guardian of a secret that defied explanation, a story that begged to be told but that I feared no one would believe. It's been 2 years since that fateful night, and I still struggle to come to terms with what happened. I've kept my promise to Elizabeth in my own way. I've researched her story, piecing together the details of her life and untimely death. I've visited her grave, leaving flowers on the anniversary of that haunting ride. Sometimes, on rainy nights, I find myself drawn to the window, half expecting to see a pale figure in a white dress standing on the street corner. The urge to get back in my taxi, to drive through the mist-shrouded streets, is almost overwhelming. But I resist, knowing that some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. I've come to realize that there are layers to our world that most people never see. That night pulled back the veil for me, showing me a reality I never knew existed. It's a knowledge that both terrifies and fascinates me. As I write this account, I wonder if anyone will believe me. But in the end, that doesn't matter. I remember Elizabeth. And as long as I do, a part of you will live on. It's been 6 months since that nightmarish ride, yet the memory still haunts my every waking moment. Before that fateful night, I was just another cab driver in the bustling city of Metropolis, working the graveyard shift to make ends meet. I'd seen my fair share of strange passengers and bizarre situations, but nothing could have prepared me for what awaited me in the early hours of that chilly autumn morning. Even now, as I write this, I question whether I should share my experience. But perhaps by putting it to paper, I can finally exorcise the demons that have plagued me since that night. The night had been slow, a typical Tuesday in late October. The streets of Metropolis were quiet, save for the occasional group of late-night revelers or weary workers heading home. I was considering calling it a night when my radio crackled to life. Unit 17, pick up at Central Station. You available? I glanced at the clock on my dashboard. 3:30 a.m. I sighed, my hand hovering over the radio. One more fare couldn't hurt, I thought. Unit 17 here. I'll take it. As I pulled up to the station, the large clock above the entrance caught my eye. 3:33 a.m. A chill ran down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. That's when I saw him. He stood alone under the harsh fluorescent lights, a tall figure in a crisp black suit. As I pulled closer, I noticed something odd about his posture. Too straight, too still. It was as if he were a mannequin someone had placed on the curb as a prank. I rolled down the window. Taxi for you, sir. He turned, and I had to suppress a gasp. His eyes were completely black, no whites visible at all. For a moment, I wondered if it was some kind of costume or contact lenses. Halloween was just around the corner, after all. Without a word, he opened the back door and slid into the seat. His movements were fluid, almost too smooth to be natural. "Where to?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. His reply came in a voice that was simultaneously deep and whisper-quiet. 1333 Shadowmere Lane. I frowned. In my 15 years of driving a cab in Metropolis, I'd never heard of such an address. But a fare was a fare. I pulled away from the curb, unaware that I was beginning a journey that would change my life forever. As we drove through the quiet streets, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, trying to get a better look at my passenger. His reflection was there, but it seemed off somehow, blurred around the edges, as if he wasn't quite solid. "So, what brings you out so late?" I asked, attempting to break the uncomfortable silence. No response. The man sat perfectly still, his black eyes fixed on some point in the distance. The silence in the cab was oppressive, broken only by the soft hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of my radio. I turned onto Maple Street, heading towards the outskirts of town where I thought Shadowmere Lane might be. That's when I noticed something strange. The buildings we were passing seemed different, older, more decrepit than I remembered. Signs that should have been familiar were now in languages I didn't recognize. I blinked hard, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me. When I looked again, everything seemed normal. But as we continued driving, the changes became more pronounced, more permanent. The streets began to twist and turn in ways that defied the city layout I knew by heart. Shadows seemed to move of their own accord, reaching out towards the cab like grasping fingers. The few pedestrians we passed looked wrong somehow, their proportions slightly off, their movements jerky and unnatural. I glanced at the clock on my dashboard, hoping to ground myself in something familiar. My heart nearly stopped. The digital display read 3:33. I blinked, looked away, and looked back. Still 3:33. No matter how long we drove, the time didn't change. That's when I heard it. A low, rhythmic murmuring coming from the back seat. I looked in the rearview mirror again. My passenger's lips were moving, forming words in a language I'd never heard before. As he spoke, the world outside the cab seemed to ripple and distort, as if reality itself was bending to the cadence of his voice. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. What had I gotten myself into? As we drove deeper into this twisted version of Metropolis, the changes became more pronounced. Streetlights flickered and bent at impossible angles, their light casting writhing shadows across the pavement. Buildings stretched and contorted, their windows becoming eyes that seemed to follow our progress. I tried to focus on driving, on finding this non-existent Shadowmere Lane, but my mind was reeling. Every street sign we passed was now in an alphabet I couldn't decipher, the letters squirming and rearranging themselves as I watched. "Look, sir," I said, my voice trembling, "I don't think this address exists. Maybe we should dash." I was cut off by a sudden, bone-chilling laugh from the back seat. It was the first sound my passenger had made besides his mysterious chanting, and it sent shivers down my spine. "Oh, it exists," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the confines of the cab. "We're getting closer. Can't you feel it?" And I could. There was a pressure building in the air, a sense of anticipation that made my skin crawl. The very fabric of reality seemed to be stretching thin, ready to tear at any moment. I glanced at the clock again, hoping against hope that time had started moving again. But no, it still read 3:33. As I watched, the numbers began to blur and shift, forming patterns that hurt my eyes to look at. Suddenly, the cab jerked to the left, as if pulled by an invisible force. I wrestled with the steering wheel, but it was useless. We were being drawn down a street that hadn't been there a moment ago, a street that twisted and coiled like a snake. "What's happening?" I cried out, panic rising in my throat. My passenger leaned forward, his black eyes gleaming in the rear-view mirror. "We're arriving," he whispered, his voice filled with an unholy glee. As we hurtled down this impossible street, my passenger began to murmur again. This time, his words seemed to fill the cab, reverberating in my bones and making my teeth ache. I couldn't understand the language, but each syllable felt like a nail being driven into my skull. The world outside the cab windows became a blur of darkness and twisted shapes. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of things that my mind refused to comprehend. Vast, writhing forms that defied physics, creatures with too many limbs and not enough faces. I tried to speak, to beg my passenger to stop, but my voice caught in my throat. The murmuring grew louder, drowning out the roar of the engine and the screech of tires. It was as if the very air was vibrating with the power of those alien words. My hands were locked on the steering wheel, knuckles white with strain. I wasn't controlling the cab anymore. It was being guided by some unseen force, drawn inexorably towards a destination I couldn't fathom. Through the haze of terror and confusion, a small part of my mind wondered if I had fallen asleep at the wheel. Perhaps this was all some vivid nightmare, born from too many late nights and too much cheap coffee. But the cold sweat on my brow and the hammering of my heart told me this was all too real. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, when I was sure my sanity would shatter under the weight of this otherworldly experience, everything stopped. The cab screeched to a halt, the murmuring ceased, and an eerie silence fell. We had arrived. The sudden silence was deafening. I sat frozen, hands still gripping the wheel, afraid to move or even breathe. Slowly, I raised my eyes to the rear-view mirror. My passenger sat motionless, his black eyes fixed on something outside the cab. "We're here," he said, his voice now eerily calm. I turned to look out the windshield and felt my heart skip a beat. We were parked in front of a building that seemed to defy logic. It twisted and shifted before my eyes, its architecture a maddening blend of angles that shouldn't exist. The street sign nearby read, Shadowmere Lane, the letters writhing as if alive. "Wait here," the man in black commanded as he opened the door. "I won't be long." Before I could protest, he stepped out of the cab. As soon as his feet touched the ground, reality seemed to ripple around him. He walked towards the impossible building, each step distorting the air like heat waves on asphalt. I watched, transfixed, as he approached the door. It opened on its own, revealing a darkness so profound it looked like a hole in the universe. My passenger turned back to me one last time, his black eyes gleaming with an otherworldly light. Then he stepped through the doorway and vanished. The moment the door closed behind my passenger, a war erupted in my mind. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to put as much distance between myself and this nightmarish place as possible. But a morbid curiosity, a need to understand what was happening, kept me rooted to the spot. Minutes ticked by, though the clock on my dashboard still stubbornly displayed 3:33. The silence was oppressive, broken only by my ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. I found myself reaching for the door handle, half convinced that I should follow my passenger into that impossible building. But as my fingers brushed the cool metal, a chill ran down my spine. An image flashed in my mind, my body, empty-eyed and hollow, trapped forever in that twisting architecture. That was the moment I knew I had to leave. My hand moved to the ignition, fingers trembling as I turned the key. The engine roared to life, sounding impossibly loud in the unnatural quiet. I spared one last glance at the building. For a split second, I thought I saw a face in one of the writhing windows. Not human, not anything I could describe. Its eyes locked with mine, and I felt a hunger so vast and alien that it threatened to swallow my very soul. That was all it took. I slammed the cab into gear and floored the accelerator, tires screeching as I sped away from Shadowmere Lane and the horrors it contained. The city blurred around me as I sped through the twisted streets, my heart pounding in my ears. Every turn I took seemed to lead me deeper into this nightmarish version of Metropolis. Street signs flickered between languages I couldn't read, buildings stretched and contorted in impossible ways. I drove blindly, with no real sense of direction, only knowing that I had to get as far away from Shadowmere Lane as possible. The radio crackled with static and inhuman voices, forcing me to rip it out and throw it onto the passenger seat. In my rearview mirror, I caught glimpses of shadowy figures pursuing the cab, their movements jerky and unnatural. Were they real, or just figments of my terrified imagination? As I took a sharp turn, the world around me suddenly flickered, like a faulty TV signal. For a brief moment, I saw the familiar streets of the metropolis I knew. Hope surged through me, and I pressed the accelerator harder, willing myself back to reality. With a jolt that nearly sent me through the windshield, the cab burst through some invisible barrier. Suddenly, I was back on the normal streets of Metropolis, the first light of dawn breaking on the horizon. I didn't stop driving until I reached my apartment, my hands shaking as I turned off the engine. For a long moment, I sat in silence, trying to process what had happened. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself it had all been a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But the lingering chill in my bones and the haunted look in my eyes told a different story. I never drove a taxi again, especially not during the night shift. And to this day, I avoid any street that might lead me near where Shadowmere Lane should be. Some fares aren't worth the price. 30 years behind the wheel, and I thought I'd seen it all. How wrong I was. Even now, as I write this in my new apartment in a city far from those woods, I question whether I should share my experience. But perhaps by putting it to paper, I can finally exorcise the demons that have plagued me since that night. The night it all happened was supposed to be my last shift. 30 years of ferrying drunks, tourists, and tired commuters around Millbrook, and I was finally hanging up my cab license. I'd already cleared out my locker at the depot, said my goodbyes to the other drivers. All that was left was one last fare. It came in just as I was about to call it a night. A long-distance ride out to Pine Grove, a small town about 50 miles up the old highway. I almost turned it down. It was late, and the old road wasn't one I particularly enjoyed driving. But something made me accept. One last adventure, I thought. The passenger was a quiet old man, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He climbed into the back without a word, and we set off into the night. As we left the city limits, the streetlights grew sparse, then disappeared altogether. The road ahead was swallowed by darkness, my headlights barely penetrating the gloom. On either side, dense forest pressed in, the trees looming like silent sentinels. I tried to make conversation, but the old man remained silent. After a while, I gave up, focusing on the winding road ahead. That's when I first noticed something was wrong. The engine, usually as reliable as sunrise, began to sputter and cough. "No, no, no," I muttered, willing the cab to keep going. But it was no use. With a final wheezing gasp, the engine died, and we rolled to a stop in the middle of nowhere. I turned the key, once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. Not even a sputter. Cursing under my breath, I turned to apologize to my passenger, only to find the back seat empty. The old man had vanished without a sound, leaving behind nothing but a faint, musty smell. A chill ran down my spine as I peered out into the darkness. The forest seemed to press in closer, the trees' branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I flicked on the interior light, its weak glow offering little comfort against the vast darkness outside. Grabbing my flashlight from the glove compartment, I stepped out of the cab. The night air was unnaturally still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. My flashlight beam danced across the road, revealing nothing but cracked asphalt stretching endlessly in both directions. I popped the hood, though I knew it was futile. I'm no mechanic, and even if I were, I doubted this was a problem that could be fixed with a wrench and some duct tape. Still, it gave me something to do, a way to stave off the growing sense of unease that was settling over me. As I leaned over the engine, a twig snapped in the forest. I whirled around, my heart pounding. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and undergrowth. But for a moment, just a split second, I could have sworn I saw something move. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small and fragile in the vast silence. "Is anyone there?" No response came, save for the faint rustling of leaves in a breeze I couldn't feel. I quickly got back into the cab, locking the doors. As I settled in for what was sure to be a long night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something out there in the darkness was watching me. As the night deepened, the silence became oppressive. I tried the radio, hoping for some news or music to break the monotony, but it produced nothing but static. Even my cell phone showed no signal. I was truly alone. It was around midnight when I first heard them, the whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling through the trees. But as I listened more closely, I realized the sounds had a rhythm, an almost speech-like quality. I pressed my ear against the window, straining to hear. The whispers seemed to be coming from all around, a soft susurration that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't make out words, not exactly, but there was a sense of urgency to the sounds, as if they were trying to tell me something. That's when I saw the first shadow move between the trees. It was just a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision, gone almost as soon as I noticed it. But it was enough to set my heart racing. More shadows followed, darting between the trees with an unnatural fluidity. They seemed to be drawing closer to the cab, their forms indistinct but unmistakably present. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But when I opened them again, the shadows were still there, closer now. And the whispers, I could almost understand them. "Join us," they seemed to say. "We've been waiting for you." I shook my head, trying to clear it. This couldn't be real. But with each passing moment, the whispers became clearer, the shadows more defined. I found myself torn between terror and a strange, almost hypnotic fascination. As the night wore on, I began to discern words and phrases among the whispers. Dark promises, terrible secrets. They spoke of ancient things that dwelled in the depths of the forest, of knowledge beyond human comprehension. And always, they called to me. Time seemed to lose all meaning as I sat there, surrounded by whispers and shadows. The darkness outside the cab window had taken on a liquid quality, rippling and shifting in ways that defied logic. The shadows had grown bolder, pressing up against the glass, their forms suggesting things that my mind refused to comprehend. I fought against the growing exhaustion, knowing instinctively that sleep would be dangerous. But it was a losing battle. My eyelids grew heavy, my thoughts becoming sluggish and confused. In my more lucid moments, I tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe I had fallen asleep at the wheel and crashed. Perhaps this was all some vivid hallucination as I lay dying in a ditch somewhere. but the persistent whispers and the cold glass against my forehead felt too real to be a dream. The whispers had become a constant drone now, their promises and threats blending together into a terrible symphony. They spoke of power beyond imagining, of secrets that could reshape reality itself. All I had to do was step out of the cab, they said. Just a few steps into the welcoming darkness of the forest. Part of me wanted to give in, to surrender to the seductive call of the whispers. But a deeper, more primal part of my being recoiled in terror. Whatever was out there in the forest, it wasn't human. And it didn't have my best interests at heart. As the night crawled on, I found myself slipping in and out of consciousness. Each time I jerked awake, the shadows seemed closer, the whispers more insistent. I knew I couldn't hold out much longer. Something had to give. In that moment of desperation, I made a decision that would change my life forever. Despite my best efforts, exhaustion finally overcame me. As my eyes closed, I felt a sensation of falling, plunging into a darkness deeper than any I had ever known. In my dream, if it was a dream, I found myself standing in a forest clearing. The trees around me were ancient, their gnarled branches reaching towards a sky that pulsed with an unnatural, sickly light. The air was thick with the scent of decay and something else, something alien and wrong. Figures emerged from the shadows between the trees. They were vaguely humanoid, but twisted and distorted in ways that defied description. Their eyes glowed with an otherworldly intelligence, and when they spoke, their voices were the whispers I had been hearing all night. "Welcome," they said in unison, their words bypassing my ears and resonating directly in my mind. "We've been waiting for you, traveler." They told me of their true nature, ancient beings that had existed long before humans walked the earth. They fed on the fear and despair of lost travelers, luring them into the depths of the forest with whispered promises and dark secrets. As they spoke, I felt my very essence being pulled apart, as if they were trying to absorb me into their collective consciousness. I tried to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed, forced to witness horrors beyond imagining. Just when I thought I would be lost forever, a sound cut through the nightmare, the familiar rumble of my cab's engine. I jolted awake with a gasp, my heart pounding in my chest. The first rays of dawn were just beginning to penetrate the gloom, casting long shadows through the trees. For a moment, I sat there, disoriented and terrified, the echoes of my nightmare still ringing in my mind. Then I noticed the sound. My engine was running. Without questioning this miracle, I grabbed the wheel and slammed the car into drive. The tires squealed as I accelerated, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that accursed stretch of forest as possible. As I sped down the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pursued. The trees seemed to bend towards the road, their branches reaching out like grasping hands. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, no longer seductive but filled with rage and hunger. I drove recklessly, taking curves at dangerous speeds, but I didn't care. All that mattered was escaping, getting back to the safety of civilization and bright lights. With each mile that passed, the whispers grew fainter, the oppressive presence of the forest receding. Finally, I saw something that made my heart leap, a gas station, its fluorescent lights a beacon of normalcy in the fading darkness. I pulled in, my hands shaking as I turned off the engine. For a long moment, I just sat there, trying to process what had happened. As I stepped out of the cab on unsteady legs, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Slowly, dreading what I might see, I turned to look at my rear-view mirror. What I saw there would haunt me for the rest of my days. To hear more stories like this, subscribe and leave a like.